I welcome you all again to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talk. For those joining us for the first time, you are welcome. We are glad that you can make it in today. Thank you very much. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Before presenting our distinguished speaker for this morning, please note that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At that point, there will be room for comments, Q&A, and any other contributions you may have. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A chat box, and we will pick them from there afterwards. Thank you. The topic of today's talk is climate change and child health. What do we know in 2024? Let's talk. Our presenter is Dr. Daniel Hellden. Dr. Daniel is a research fellow in the first UNU hub, University of Calgary, here in Canada. His work at the UNU Hub's Institute for Transdisciplinary Scholarship and the One Child, Every Child initiative focuses on the impact of climate change on children in Canada and globally. He will tell us more about this. He has established research collaborations with UNICEF and academic institutions in Uganda, Somalia, and the DRC, as well as a large international network of leading climate change and child health experts. He's well published and was a lead writer for the UNICEF report titled A Threat to Progress: Confronting the Effects of Climate Change on Child Health and Well-being. This has contributed to the UNICEF for the upcoming COP29. So I'm sure he has a lot to talk about, and we have a lot to learn from the insights he's going to provide on climate change and child health. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Daniel Hellden. Dr. Daniel, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored and glad to be with you all. It's very interesting days, and I'm very happy to be with you. As you know, very graciously introduction remark. I'm situated at the University of Calgary within the One Child Every Child initiative, but I also want to give acknowledgement to my former affiliation, Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, Sweden, where a large part of this work that I'll be presenting also took part. And as we have approximately, or we have a little less than an hour now, I would like to focus this seminar around first having a short, rapid overview of climate change, and then focus in on the majority of time on the unique vulnerability of children to climate change and its impact, as we know in 2024. Follow up with some key research gaps, themes, and policy recommendations that we have identified. And then, of course, leave as much time as possible for a Q&A and a general discussion. And very much look forward to discussing and learning from you on this topic as well. And we'll skip this part about Karolinska Institutet. This is where most of the work was done. But the basics of climate change is that we're essentially living in a very detailed and very narrow corridor of life. So there's, if you look across time and backwards, you can see that there has been a glacial interglacial limit cycle where the temperature of the Earth has changed. And for the last 10,000 years, we lived in what researchers have called the Holocene, meaning a relatively stable, relatively warm, stable period of time. However, what we're doing right now is that we're starting to break the planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries is a concept where climate change and temperature is one of them. And we're moving into the Anthropocene, meaning that the impacts that we have on the Earth is contributing significantly to its systems. And what we are facing with is essentially two different scenarios where we have human emissions and planetary boundaries breaking, possibly leading to us going beyond the planetary threshold and into a so-called hothouse Earth, or with Earth system stewardship and sustainability, making sure that we reach a stabilized Earth that has a high level of stability. So this is where we are in a bit more of a grander scheme of things. Climate change in general is starting to get felt both at a personal level and in broader levels. So in Sweden, for instance, one of the most common things that are notified is that the highest peak is actually now the second highest peak, as this south peak has overtaken due to the warming. Here in Canada, one of the most prominent visualizations of climate change is the recurrent wildfires, but that we also see, of course, in southern parts of Europe. In other parts of the world, we've had over the last couple of years many extreme weather events, which has, through attribution science, showcased to be linked and or increased in frequency or intensity to climate change. So it's felt throughout the world in different ways. And this is something that has also become, of course, over the last at least 10 to 5 years, more and more in the public's eye as well, across the world, across sectors, both in businesses, in culture, in the public's eye, and of course, from a Swedish perspective, starting or essentially being proponed by the youth and Greta Thunberg and the youth movement a couple years back. So climate change is really on everybody's minds, but it's important to also sometimes take a step back and reflect and be certain about what it actually means. So climate change, as defined by the IPCC, is a significant change in the climate that can be identified through statistical tests by changes in the mean and or variability, and that takes place over an extended period of time, usually decades or longer, maybe due to human activity, especially carbon dioxide, but also, especially for longer time periods, natural changes. However, the weather is the state or change of state of an atmosphere at a given moment or over a very short period of time. So it's important to remember that climate change is something that happens over a significant or extended period of time. And this can sometimes also mean difficulties when looking at the scientific studies and looking at the research on climate change impact on human health in general and child health specifically, as these two concepts are not always clearly outlined or defined in the research. To just give a brief overview of where we are right now when it comes to some key climate change aspects, we have reached approximately or at least 1.1 to 1.3 degrees of average mean warming. We see that from essentially, and that number depends on which referral period you're using. But what you can see is that there has been a steady incline in the average global warming over the last at least 40 years. And what's just been recently highlighted, I haven't added it in here, but is really the warming since 2010 10 that has become exceptional, and especially during the last year, that have surprised climate scientists and different climate models, with essentially temperatures accelerating at a pace that models and researchers did not expect just 10 years ago. And this is reflected by the record year of last year, where we had instances, for instance, in November, where the daily average mean temperature reached the 2 degrees Celsius. And as you can see here, there across the different decades, it's become warmer and warmer. But that there have been especially warm and exceptional years over the last just 3 or 4 years. Of course, we have the El Nino effect ongoing, but it's a very much a long-term trend that it extends beyond El Nino patterns. Just a few notes also around the carbon dioxide emission and the different world regions. So historically, European countries and United States have emitted the largest part of the CO2 emissions, including where I'm here in North America and in Canada. China and other Asian countries have, over the last especially 20 to 30 years, significantly increased the CO2 emissions and stand now for quite a large part of the emissions. It's also important to sometimes remember, or in these instances, remember where the emissions come from, the CO2 emissions, which is the main, although there's many others, the main greenhouse gas. And the large majority of it comes from the energy sector. Energy use in buildings, transportations, and in industry makes up the vast majority of the emissions. We have also, of course, a large part for agriculture, forestry, and land use, and some other industry and waste. But this is really to showcase that it's a lot about energy in industry, transportations, and buildings. And I just wanted to highlight where I am right now in Calgary, in Alberta. It's one of the largest oil producers in the world, given the rich oil sands in the north of Alberta, and is emits quite a lot of CO2 emissions, roughly 38% of Canada's total emissions, 270 megatons, and the vast majority of that is due to the oil and gas industry. Just as a small comparison, Sweden emits roughly 45 megatons, albeit with a little bit of a smaller population. So there's vast differences, of course, across the globe. And going a little bit more into where the impacts are for human health and children and different scenarios, what these different emissions actually mean. We have, of course, the different projected shared social pathways. And we have different projections on where the current policies and pledges and targets might lead us to. This has a couple of years, so this is not completely fresh. So take the numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt. But at the current rate, at least thought previously, was that we would, with the current policies in place, reach approximately 2.5 to 2.9 degrees warming by the end of the century. And if we, as a society and different countries, actually delivered on the pledges and promises, we would reach approximately 2 degrees of warming. Now, the IPCC report have detailed that this is, or detailed 2 or 3 years ago, that this scenario would be the likeliest, with 1.5 degrees warming during this time and by mid-century, and around 2 degrees warming by end of century, and 2.7 by really the end of century. However, with this accelerated climate change that is now looking to be, that is beyond the current scenarios that we have, it's more looking as we're going into third pathways, where we are most definitely reaching 2 degrees Celsius warming by mid-century, and end of century around 3 to 3.5 degrees warming. So this is, of course, very worrying, and something that definitely has implications for the impacts that I will discuss shortly on children. And as we all know, every 10th of a degree makes a lot of difference. And also to say that the global average temperature is an average, and that different countries and regions will be warming at a significantly higher rate than the mean average. So this is very worrying. To just give some brief examples, and I'm taking the example of Canada here when it comes to health in general of climate change, and just to give a bit of a flavor of the context specificity of climate change. So in the east, we are looking at in Canada possibilities of relocation stress from sea level rise, and especially coastal erosion. In the southern part of Canada, or almost across Canada at this point, there's increased risk of heat-related illnesses, heat stress, etc. Regarding ecosystem, there's been also in Sweden, but in Canada as well, an increase in tick-borne diseases and the spread of ticks across the country. The season of severity and duration of pollen season is increasing. More in Alberta and closer to the mountain range, there is increased frequency and risk of wildfires, but also floods and droughts given the changes in the weather. And of course, perhaps the most important one is the warming of the north of Canada and the Arctic regions, which put a heavy stress on the possibility of indigenous peoples to live lives as they've lived them, and also concrete health impacts from various sources. So this is just a flavor of how climate change impacts across a country such as Canada. Focusing now a little bit more into child health. Child health over the last decades have been a success story. There remains much to be done, but it's important to recognize that the under 5 child mortality is now just below 5 million, and has been more than halved since the 1990s. And we see progress in almost every country in the world, and we see that there is clear efforts, and there are clear ways to improve child health, mortality, and morbidity through simple interventions that have been successful, such as, or relatively simple, but such as vaccinations, water and sanitation system, better nutrition, and improvement in general health services. So it's important to remember that global child health, to some degree, is really a success story. However, there is no child health without planetary health. And it's also important to note, especially when you look at this map, that children living in countries that are already vulnerable, meaning that they have already high levels of child mortality and morbidity, will also be the ones most affected. We'll maybe talk a little bit more around that during discussion, but there's a clear overlay of vulnerability to so to say, general diseases and disorders of children, and where the highest impact of climate change will occur in the world. And before moving on to sharing a bit more details on the actual impact on children and unique vulnerabilities, I just want to ensure and really acknowledge that the work presented now comes from mainly two different sources. One is a review that we published in Lancet Planetary Health in 2021. That we did collectively, a group of leading authors, and most recently the UNICEF report, A Threat to Progress, Confronting the Effects of Climate Change on Child Health and Well-being, which was a collaborative effort, and we had input from more than 30 experts in the field. So this was really a collaborative effort, and a hallmark for our understanding of climate change and children's health. Moving into the unique vulnerabilities of children, this is perhaps something that is very clear if you have children of your own or work in pediatrics and clinically with children as I do, but there is a need to recognize that children are not small adults, and the impact of climate change changes quite rapidly throughout the different developmental stages. For instance, already during pregnancy, of course, there's a close dyad between the woman and the child, and fetuses can be exposed in utero to physical, biological, and chemical agents that have implications for risk, for different risks, and I will go through them in a bit later down the line. But then when they are born and they are infants and early childhood, they have rapidly developing immune system and organs, they have higher metabolisms, they breathe more air per unit of weight, which makes them also at higher risk for certain climate impacts. And when they develop into adolescence, they have the developing brain structure and function, physical and hormonal changes, and again, a higher metabolism that have implications for climate change impacts. So it's important to recognize that climate change and its impacts on children varies significantly across the different developmental stages. And at this point, we haven't really gotten into this level of detail when it comes to actually assessing the impact, but more on that later. So the way that we have structured, or the framework that we're using around climate change in the UNICEF report and child health, is that we identified the most relevant, the ones listed by IPCC, climate hazards that have a significant impact on children. And these are extreme heat, droughts, wildfires, floods and storms, ecosystem changes, and then also air pollution. But perhaps even as important or more important are the impact of climate change on different other social determinants of health that we call multipliers. So factors made worse by climate change, such as water scarcity and contamination, which is a big part, but also food insecurity and contamination, infrastructural damage, service disruption, particularly when it comes to social protection systems and the health system itself, and also, of course, if it results in displacement. These are determined based on inequities and different factors that determine the severity of the actual impact. And here we have well-known factors such as socioeconomic status, the gender of the child, location of where the family is living, existing health status already of the child or family, and of course the country context and capacity to adapt to climate change and to hazards. And this leads to impacts that contribute significantly to child mortality and morbidity. We have pregnancy complications and adverse birth outcomes, malnutrition, infectious disease, injuries, non-communicable diseases, impacts on neurodevelopment and mental health, and more general impacts or effects on well-being and the possibility of children to thrive. In this work, we listed and found quite a few detailed specific impacts of climate change on children across different contexts. I won't go through these in too much detail, but just highlighting a few. So for pregnancy complications and birth outcomes, it's especially linked, or the two main outcomes are really low birth weight and preterm birth through different climate change impacts, and I'll go through that a little bit more later. Malnutrition is, of course, a very important determinant of child mortality and morbidity, and climate change has been linked quite significantly to increased risk of stunting and wasting and underweight, but also to some extent overweight, obesity, and micronutrient deficiencies. When it comes to infectious diseases, pneumonia and respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, but also, of course, increased spread of different vector-related infectious diseases. You see direct impacts in the form of increased risk of different injuries, and non-communicable diseases is a growing burden. Heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke, increased risk of asthma. We also see some emerging evidence when it comes to impacts on neurodevelopment and mental health, both, so to say, subjective or more well-being aspects, but in some instances as well in concrete increased of mental illness. And of course, there's maybe a more untangible aspect that affects well-being of children, but can be quite concrete, such as sleep quality and increased risk of violence and abuse in settings that are hit by these climate hazards. And perhaps the most important take-home message is that both, so to say, the level of not only the magnitude or the spread of the different child-specific impacts, but also realizing that all of these impacts can have severe and lifelong implications. So even though it's something that happens during childhood, it really has lifelong implications for the health of the person. Some more specific impacts that I wanted to share with you from the report, and just to give you again a little bit more of a flavor of the main impacts across the different climate hazards. So when it comes to extreme heat, can lead to pregnancy complication, especially preterm birth and low birth weight. And beyond the direct impacts of heat, higher temperatures are associated with increased in all-cause mortality rates among younger children, and among older children and adolescents, extreme heat can lead to poor cognitive and physical development. And there's estimations that by 2050, almost every child under the age of 18 in the world, nearly 2.2 billion, will be exposed to high heat wave frequency, up from only 24% in 2020. So this will be one of the largest threats and hazards, and have been shown also perhaps the most concrete impacts already. Droughts have multiple health impacts, as already known. It increases the all-cause rates of mortality and morbidity among children, of course leads to water scarcity and food insecurity that leads to increased risk of undernutrition and spread of infectious diseases. It also has severe implications for mental health. Living through droughts and other extreme weather events is strong psychological distress. Climate change will lead to more increases in temperature, severity of droughts, and the frequency will increase, particularly if global warming reach 2 degrees or above, which it is unfortunately slated to be. Wildfires are prevalent in many regions in the world, particularly perhaps in South America and here in Canada and North America, but also in many other places. Beyond the physical harm to children, which is almost always minor, it's particularly the wildfire smoke that can lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes and interact negatively to some extent, with neurodevelopment in children. Exposure to wildfire smoke can lead to respiratory diseases and increases the possibility of respiratory infections. And there, of course, exists negative mental health impacts from experiencing wildfires as well. And there's projections to show that there will be a global increase in wildfires by 50% by the end of the century. So quite a large increase as well. Floods and storms have, of course, been linked to many different health outcomes, but particularly when it comes to pregnancy complications, adverse birth outcomes, and to some extent also emerging evidence on adverse impacts on neurodevelopment, and these can have long-lasting consequences. Flooding can lead to increased spread of infectious diseases that children are susceptible to, but also increased risk of exposure to toxicants. And again, mental health impacts cannot be overstated. And without adaptation and with the accelerated rate of climate change, around half of the world's population will be exposed to flooding by end of the century. Air pollution is related to both burning of fossil fuels directly and dust storms and other forms of air pollution, such as allergens and spread of those. It's linked to worsened respiratory capacity in children and development of worsening of asthma, for instance. It's also some evidence showing that allergic and atopic diseases might become or are set to become more prevalent with this increased spread of allergens. And there's an intricate link between climate change, the burning of fossil fuels, and air pollution. And these are set to increase overall in the world. There's clear change in disease patterns. There's increased risk for children of zoonotic diseases, such as zoonotic diseases transmission, such as malaria, dengue fever, Zika virus, and also Lyme disease. There's also a burden of other infectious disease pathogens, especially those causing respiratory infections and diarrheal diseases that are set to become even more prevalent in some geographies, might be less prevalent in others. So there's a context specificity. But it also have, of course, important implications for antimicrobial resistant patterns that are becoming a larger and larger threat to children. For instance, there are some estimations that an additional 4.7 billion people may be at risk of malaria and dengue by 2017. And so these are some of the concrete implications and impacts of climate change on children. I want to again emphasize the risk multipliers. In some research and what we have seen is that to some extent the impact on climate change is really through these risk multipliers, and the erosion of these basic social determinants of health is really a key mechanism for the impact. So water scarcity and contamination, food insecurity and contamination, infrastructure damage, service disruption through various child health services, and the risk of displacement have in themselves a very, very oftentimes adverse impact on the health of children. Moving into a little bit more of taking a helicopter view of the research in 2024 and what we know so far, and some key themes is really there really is three at this point. And the first one, which I've already alluded to, is around inequity and inequality. So we know that climate change impacts on children will hit those already vulnerable more. It both in the sense of the vulnerabilities of or inequities of the children themselves, but also across geographies and across the world. So it's really climate change and children's health is very much tied into health inequity across the world. We also see that there's to a very large degree, context specificity when it comes to the impacts, and this is of course logical given the context specificity of climate change itself. But there are some general trends and some differences when it comes to contexts and geographies. And one of the more studied and perhaps more clear divisions is the difference of climate change impacts in urban and rural areas. And studies find oftentimes, not always, but often find different levels of impacts across urban and rural areas, both in the, so to say, magnitude, mortality and morbidity measures, but also in the types of impacts. What's also important to remember is that there's a big part, many of the studies, both quantitatively and qualitatively, relies on a set of assumptions, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty regarding some of the key assumptions and the actual measurements and the underlying research, so to say. And that's inherent in the difficulty in this area, because what we are trying to do in climate change and children's health research is really to ensure that climate change is actually causing the change in environment where the children is living. And then we try to see if the change in the environment or the change in the context of the child is actually leading to an health impact. So that's two very difficult relationships to assess. And so inherently there's, and usually most researchers in public health, of course, only look at the part of the local environment and the impact on children. So inherently there is a lot of uncertainty. And this is inherent, but also one of the biggest gaps or difficulties with research in this field. And noting just a few key research gaps that are evident when you look across the literature on climate change and children's health, most studies are from high-income countries. Although there has been increased focus of research in low and middle-income countries, still most studies are from high-income countries. There's also quite little evidence of the beneficial or harmful effects of other determinants, such as social, political, and commercial, on climate change impacts on physical and mental health of children. So the connection between those broader determinants and climate change and children's health haven't really been done. The quantitative analysis and the quantitative research usually don't disaggregate by sex or age group. So this comes back to the difficulty around the unique vulnerabilities of children, because we know that they are uniquely vulnerable, but oftentimes quantitative studies and research lump children together as under 5-year-olds, for instance, or under 18-year-olds, and don't disaggregate by gender, which makes it hard to generalize the results and usability of the results in specific settings and for particular age groups. There has almost been none qualitative research within this area. This was at least true when we did the review back in 2021. Over the last 3 years, there's been an uptick and advance in this area. Understanding the lived experience of children and families in different climate, living through different climate hazards have increased. So it's not completely missing, but almost at this point. What has become more and more evident and more urgently perhaps given the acceleration of climate change is that children's health and well-being in mitigation and adaptation efforts in terms of climate change is virtually non-existent. So there's very few studies, almost none, that examines different climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies and their impact on children. And this is, of course, a very big gap given the emphasis around the climate change discussion on mitigation and adaptation. And what to some extent can be called the holy grail, and what we don't have right now is a combination of climate change models with health outcomes in children. So we don't have a clear methodology or a way to combine climate change models and different statistical approaches with concrete health outcomes in a geographic setting. So this is a key methodological development that needs to happen for us to increase our knowledge around the impacts of climate change on children's health today, but also looking ahead, given different projections for the next decades. I want to just touch upon these recommendations and highlight a few. These recommendations comes from UNICEF and the report. And at the high level, we still emphasize the need to limit emissions to meet the 1.5 degrees threshold to ensure the best interest of the child. So it's important to note that the Paris Agreement also have severe implications for children's health and the child perspective, and this perspective cannot be understated when you are discussing policy. And then unfortunately, it's high time to protect and make sure that we adapt to societies so that we protect children from the impacts of climate change that are already occurring and is set to accelerate. And thirdly, it's important to make informed decisions based on the impact on child health and well-being. And we have in the report, you find a number of little bit more concrete recommendations that UNICEF is pushing in various areas. I won't go through these in detail, but just noting maybe for this audience the importance of climate resilient water and sanitation infrastructure, and again highlighting the close link between water and sanitation infrastructure and impacts on children from climate change. And I'll also skip this one as it's an overview. To sum up the presentation and some key messages. Overall, there's a growing body of research showing that climate change acts through multiple pathways to negatively affect child health and well-being. However, there exist gaps in our understanding, especially how climate change interacts with other determinants to affect child health and well-being. There's a clear need to better understand and to focus in on child health and climate change mitigation and adaptation, for instance, water and sanitation systems. However, this is not to say that there isn't enough to start working. There are key evidence. We have evidence. We know lots of things when it comes to climate change and children's health. And there's really no excuse to not include child health perspectives and their impacts in climate change discussions. So there's a real need to accelerate and increase the level of discussion at different levels, both at an overarching policy level, but also down into concrete actions. So with that, I will close off. This is just a picture of the amazing northern lights that we saw here in Canada just a week or two ago. Yes, so I will close there, and I'm leaving it back to you, Grace, and hopefully there's some interesting questions, and we can have a little bit of a discussion for the remaining of the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. The information I've had, I guess pre or touched on my motherhood instinct. So it made me a bit sad, and yeah. So I'm a bit sober, really, processing, many of the information you are providing. Not because one doesn't have a fair idea of how climate change and its effect, will impact on children, but I guess with, the way you brought it home and the statistics, some of the statistics that came out, make it really very sobering, for me right now. But the first thing I want to pick on is you made a statement saying children are not young adults. Can you please explain a bit more, expatiate on that?
Absolutely. So maybe to begin, it's sometimes in global health there can be this emphasis on a certain group is more vulnerable than another. So I definitely don't want to pin children against, so to say, adults or older people, because we know that the impacts of climate change will significantly hamper the health and well-being of older people and adults and people with chronic disabilities, etc. But I do believe that there has been at least from research, there have been and as we saw it in the report, and now I'm speaking a little bit, now I'm just talking, so to say, that there's a bit of an emphasis on that if we adapt to climate change in general, this will help everybody. And there haven't been the detailed discussion around children and that they are uniquely vulnerable. So just going back to this picture here regarding the unique vulnerabilities of children, they have, I mean, it's quite clear, of course, in your personal life, perhaps that a 1 month old does not have the same possibility to or resilience to health distress as a 2-year-old. But it's the similar thing when it comes to 10 or 15 years old, and that the developing physiology and different cognitive functions really makes it so that climate change impacts, such as, for instance, flooding or heat, really have different implications of children of different ages. So that's very, and you can't downsize, because sometimes there's also a point that researchers and others tries to downsize an adult and to think that this would work in a general setting for all population and not taking specific consideration to the unique vulnerabilities of children. So I think that's key. I'm hoping that I'm answering your question, Grace.
Yeah, you actually did. What I wanted, I guess I achieved what I wanted, in you further explaining to make people really appreciate the need for differentiation, in research, especially now that climate change is the in thing that everybody is pushing towards, these aspects of research into climate change and all that, so this frequent way of lumping, everyone into the same box you won't see much, by doing that, so I appreciate you, kind of explaining more to make us realize that they have unique vulnerabilities. You know, the level of immunity, you know, it's so delicate that you can't just lump everybody together, you know, as children. You know, I also appreciate the fact that already from the gap you're you know, showing that data still needs to be disaggregated by sex, because from everything you still presented, we still can't see, okay, maybe more boys than girls, you know, in that regard, more boy infants than girl infants, you know. So there's huge opportunities here, you know, for research, particularly in differentiating. You know, differentiation also comes from, you know, the geographic locations, you know, the context is just diverse, you know. So as much as you want to gain, you know, the knowledge, the generic knowledge very quickly, it's also important to be zeroing in on the differences so that we can capture all these nuances together, you know, for a more holistic policy, you know, to drive all this. So I quite appreciate that, you know. But in terms of the helicopter view now, inequality, the inequity, the context issue that makes differentiation really very problematic in research in particular. I'm wondering, you know, especially when it comes to this low income economies, you know, apologies if, you know, you know, for my concern in this regard. You know, yeah, you made a statement about, and I think also an evidence towards the fact that, you know, most of the information we even have are from affluent nations, you know, and zeroing in, there's still a lot to do. So in the short term, what can one do, you know, to alleviate this issue for children in that region?
Very, very, very good question. And I just want to maybe first make a comment that although we don't have much research right now, there are different research projects underway, led by researchers in low and middle countries that are doing amazing work. So I'm very excited, horrified of the results sometimes, to be honest, but excited that this is something that is led by professors and researchers across low and middle income countries, and that these research is starting to come out and will coming out more and more in the next year or two. I think the key thing I think to recognize, and this is something that we're struggling with, and I know that the UNICEF colleagues are working on it right now, is to recognize and to make sure that child health and well-being is included when you discuss climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. And so what we're working on right now, and I know that UNICEF has gotten a lot of interest in this and feedback from country offices, etc., is that governments are really asking what do we mean when we say that they should take child health into consideration for climate change adaptation. And at this point, we don't have a clear answer, unfortunately, but we need to start the conversation. And we are looking to try to get that evidence out there as soon as possible for country offices of different UN organizations and, of course, governments to have in their hands, so that we can clearly show what are the adaptations or what are the considerations that you need to have when it comes to climate adaptation and mitigation for children. So I think that's that's the short term kind of what you really can do. Yes, I would. Yeah, and there's lots more of things to say, but I think that's the main one. Yes.
Oh, okay. And before I give the floor to my colleagues who wants to ask a question, I'm wondering, in terms of taking this forward, that there was something around causation that you mentioned, along the line, assessing if climate change is actually the cause, of some of those impacts, and also checking or investigating whether those impacts really lead to those specific health outcomes. How do you propose to proceed on this?
Yes, so this is I mean you're touching really on kind of the holy grail, and you might have noticed here that I haven't a number or a statistic for the number of children dying from climate change each year, and that's simply because we don't have it. We have one or two rough estimates, but isn't really possible to say. And this is something that is that global partners are working on, although there's also an ongoing discussion if a number is actually feasible or, so to say, meaningful, because to some extent it's a number is most likely going to be an underrepresentation of the actual mortality or the deaths of children from climate change. And so it's very difficult to assess. But what is happening in the research sphere and, for instance, the Global Burden of Disease team and UNICEF and we here at University of Calgary are working to try to create kind of a spatial map of the impact of climate change and overlay that with vulnerabilities of children. And in that way, you can see where children that are vulnerable to climate change live and the climate change impact that they're having right now and that they will have given different projections. The climate change children's, I'm sorry here, but maybe this will make it a little bit clearer. Now I'm just going, I have some extra slides here. So the climate change and children's risk index is something that the UNICEF developed, where you overlay climate and environmental risks with vulnerability to child health, essentially child health vulnerability, and you add those together to get a sense of where children are having the highest impacts. And this is now done at a country level, so quite high level, but the work is to zoom in and be able to do this on a much more specific geographical level, and that could possibly get us some answers to these questions around climate change and impacts.
All right. Alexa is asking, you mentioned a gap in climate change literature with regard to qualitative research. How can researchers ensure qualitative research, particularly in the low and middle income countries, is accurate? Let me rephrase that. How can researchers ensure qualitative research is accurate, particularly in low and middle income countries? By examining climate change impacts rather than ongoing challenges associated with socioeconomic issues, governance, wash challenges, etc. In other words, what constitutes as a climate exacerbated impact to health and well-being with regard to lived experiences? I hope you got that.
Yes, and it's a very good question, because it touches on two different points, or difficulties in research. I guess the first one is that in order to actually conduct this type of research, you need to work, I think at least, in an interdisciplinary way and ensure that you actually have climate scientists or climate researchers on your team on the outset of doing this type of research. And this having those competencies, because usually in global health we don't include climate scientists or researchers to that level, But including that skill set and understanding, they can help to ensure that you capture both, so to say, the correct qualitative data that you would like to have, but also to look at the potential, or look at the link between, so to say, the conditions that you're doing the qualitative work and the link to climate change. And so, and the second point is around this difficulty of attributing conditions to climate change. There's ongoing research, or there is a field within climate change research that is called attribution science, whereby you can assess statistically if an extreme weather event, for instance, is caused by climate change, and to what degree of intensity and or severity. So there are measures and research within the field of climate change to assess kind of the link. But of course, it is very, very difficult to kind of dissect or look separately and isolate, so to say, climate change impacts from other social determinants of health or the society at large. Perhaps the most meaningful way is to you have to include those conditions as well, but to have the lens of the concept of climate change and its impact in your research question when you're going into your investigation, and include the disciplines that you need, being also climate research and climate scientists.
Thank you, Daniel. I wish we have more time to explore. You know, there's still many more areas I would like you to talk on. Kaveh, do you have any?
Because we're over time, I think I would only thank you for your insightful talk. It's a long journey for us, and we have advocates for different groups. It's good that you're advocating for children. Thank you so much.
All right. On that note, we've come to the end of today's presentation. For everyone who has joined us, we say thank you once again, and we invite you to please participate in the next UNU-INWEH Science Talk next week. You know, on behalf of everyone, my director and everyone at UNU, Dr. Daniel, a big thank you.
Thank you, everybody.